He had buried a woman who was never in the ground. For 8 years, a man everyone feared knelt in front of a single grave, once a month, in the same cemetery, at the same hour, and said the same 4 words. Nobody ever heard what those 4 words were. Nobody was brave enough to get close enough to listen. Until one gray morning, a young woman with dirt under her fingernails and a pair of pruning shears in her back pocket walked past him like he was just another visitor, and asked him something nobody else had dared to ask in almost a decade. If you're really sorry, why do you keep apologizing to someone who can't hear you? He turned around slowly, like the words had physically touched him. Men who worked for him had learned not to speak unless spoken to. Men who crossed him didn't get the chance to speak again. But this woman, a gardener named Naomi, had no idea who he was. She only knew that a grave in her care had been getting fresh flowers every month from someone who never signed the visitor's log. She didn't know his name. She didn't know what he did for a living. She only knew that grief, real grief, doesn't usually look like guilt. And his did. That single question would set off a chain of events that neither of them could stop. It would drag secrets out of locked filing cabinets, out of retired police officers who swore they remembered nothing, out of a funeral home that closed its doors decades ago and never should have opened them in the first place. Because the woman buried in that grave was never actually there, and somebody had known it the whole time. Before we go further into how a mafia boss and an immigrant gardener ended up unraveling a secret this deep, let's set the stage. Because to understand why Naomi's simple question hit him so hard, you need to understand who he used to be, who she is, and why fate placed her hands on the exact plot of earth that held the biggest lie of his life. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Here is where our story truly begins. To understand why this particular grave meant so much to him, you have to understand what he lost. And to understand why Naomi couldn't walk away from a question that wasn't even hers to ask, you have to understand what she was raised to believe about the dead, and the living, and the space in between where secrets usually hide. This is a story about a man who built walls out of guilt so thick that even his closest men never saw past them, and a woman who never learned how to walk past a wall without wondering what it was hiding. It's a story about a grave that shouldn't have existed the way it did, a funeral that happened before anyone had actually died, and 2 people who would spend months pulling at a thread neither of them fully understood, until it unraveled everything they thought they knew about loss, love, and second chances. Stay with us, because by the end of this, you may never look at a quiet grave, or a quiet stranger, the same way again. Long before he became a man other men whispered about in hallways, Alexander was just someone trying to survive a world that had already decided who he'd become. He didn't choose that life. He inherited it the way some people inherit debt or a family name or a house with too many ghosts already living in it. By the time he was in his 20s, he was already known in certain circles as someone who got things done quietly, efficiently, and without asking too many questions. He told himself it was temporary. He told himself he'd get out one day, once he had enough saved, enough distance, enough of a plan. Then he met her. She wasn't from his world. She worked at a small flower shop near the harbor, the kind of place that smelled like rain and cut stems, and she had a laugh that made grown men in tailored suits feel foolish for taking themselves so seriously. Her name doesn't matter yet. What matters is that she saw the parts of him nobody else bothered to look for. She believed there was still a version of him worth waiting for. For the first time in his adult life, he wanted something more than power. He wanted a quiet house, porch, a child who wouldn't grow up afraid of their own father. She was carrying that child when everything fell apart. One night, she simply didn't come home. He searched for her the way a man searches when he still believes he can fix anything with enough money or enough fear. 3 days later, police told him there had been a fire at a warehouse near the docks. They said the fire had taken everything and everyone inside, and that identification had been difficult but conclusive. There was a funeral. A small one. He didn't cry in front of anyone. He simply stopped being the man who was trying to leave that life, and became, fully and permanently, the man the streets had always expected him to be. Every month after that, on the same date, he visited her grave. He never told anyone why. His men learned early that the subject didn't exist. Nobody followed him there. Nobody asked. Meanwhile, an ocean away, a young girl was being raised by her grandmother in a small home surrounded by more plants than furniture. Her grandmother taught her that everything growing in the ground deserved attention, whether anyone was watching or not. She used to say something Naomi never forgot. Some graves hide memories, others hide lies. At the time, Naomi thought it was just something old women said to sound wise. She didn't know that one day, those words would become the compass she needed to survive. When her grandmother passed away, Naomi kept two things: her gardening tools and that sentence. Years later, when a job opportunity brought her across the world to work maintaining graves and gardens at a quiet cemetery overlooking the city, she didn't think twice about taking it. She needed the work. She needed a fresh start. What she didn't expect was to feel an inexplicable pull toward one particular section of the cemetery. A section she was drawn to long before she ever noticed the man in black who visited it once a month. She didn't know his name either. She only knew that whoever visited that grave was hurting in a way that felt strangely familiar to her, though she couldn't explain why. Neither of them understood yet that their two unrelated griefs were about to collide. By the time Naomi arrived at the cemetery for her first day of work, Alexander had already become something of a myth among the staff. The older groundskeepers spoke about him in hushed tones, always careful to change the subject whenever a new hire asked too many questions. They told her, without ever quite saying it outright, that there were sections of the cemetery you simply left alone on certain days of the month. Naomi wasn't the type to be warned off so easily. She'd grown up in a household where curiosity was treated as a virtue rather than a flaw, where her grandmother encouraged her to ask why the roses in the front yard bloomed differently than the ones in the back, why some soil held onto water and some let it slip straight through. Naomi carried that same instinct into every corner of her life, including the parts of it that other people had quietly agreed not to look at too closely. She noticed, within her first few weeks, that one particular row of graves seemed to receive more care than any of the others, despite there being no official record of a family member requesting it. The grass around it was trimmed more precisely. The stone was cleaned more often than cemetery policy required. And every month, without fail, someone replaced the flowers before the sun came up, leaving no trace of who they were, only the faint impression of boots in the dew-covered grass. She started arriving earlier than her shift required, partly out of dedication to her work, and partly, if she was honest with herself, out of a growing need to understand who was behind this quiet, private ritual. It took nearly 2 months before she finally saw him for herself, stepping out of a car with no driver visible, walking toward that same grave with flowers in his hand and something unreadable behind his eyes. She almost turned away. Everything about him suggested a man who wanted to be left alone. But something about the way he knelt, the way his shoulders folded inward like he was trying to make himself smaller than his grief, reminded her of every story her grandmother used to tell about people who buried more than bodies in the ground. So she stayed. And eventually she spoke. Naomi wasn't the type to leave a question alone once it had settled into her. After that first conversation by the grave, she couldn't stop thinking about the man who never smiled, who never brought an umbrella even when it poured, who knelt in the mud like it was a form of penance. She started noticing small things, details most people would walk right past. The grave he visited had fresh flowers every single month, but there was never a delivery record. No florist ever came to drop them off. Someone was placing them there personally, early enough that no one else was awake to see it happen. Then there were the records. Naomi had access to the cemetery's archive room as part of her job, mostly filled with old maintenance logs and outdated burial permits nobody had digitized yet. One slow afternoon, out of simple curiosity, she pulled the file for the grave in question. What she found didn't make sense. The burial permit was dated 3 days before the woman's reported death. She stared at the paper for a long time, convinced it had to be a clerical error. Old paperwork was full of mistakes, dates transposed, names misspelled, forms filed late. But the more she compared it against other records from that same month, the more she realized this wasn't a mistake at all. Someone had prepared a funeral before there was supposed to be anyone to bury. She didn't tell anyone yet. Not because she was afraid, but because she wasn't sure what she was looking at. A coincidence didn't explain a filing this specific. A conspiracy felt too dramatic for a quiet cemetery on a hillside. But then she found the second document. Tucked behind a stack of unrelated paperwork in a box marked for disposal, there was a second death certificate. Same woman's name, different date, different signature at the bottom. 2 official records, 2 different truths. Only one of them could be real. Naomi knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. The next time Alexander came to visit the grave, she was waiting near the gate, holding both documents against her chest like they might disappear if she let go of them. "Have you ever checked if she's really there?" she asked him. He didn't answer with words. He answered by walking away so fast that his driver had to jog to catch up with him. But that night, for the first time in 8 years, he didn't sleep. He sat alone in a house too large for one person, staring at a phone full of contacts he could call to make almost any problem disappear, and realized none of them could answer the only question that mattered anymore. He thought about calling the retired officer who had originally handled the case, a man he hadn't spoken to in years out of respect for a grief he assumed was settled. He thought about the funeral director who had arranged everything so quickly, so quietly, back when Alexander was too broken to ask why anything was moving so fast. For the first time, he allowed himself to consider a possibility he had refused for 8 years. What if the story he'd been told wasn't simply tragic, but constructed? What if the fire, the ashes, the funeral, all of it, had been arranged rather than discovered? The thought terrified him more than any enemy he had ever faced in his life. Enemies he understood. Enemies could be reasoned with, fought, or eliminated. A carefully built lie, sustained for 8 years by people clever enough to make grief itself the perfect cover story, was something else entirely. He returned to the cemetery 2 days later, not to visit the grave, but to find Naomi. She was kneeling beside a different row of flowers, sleeves rolled up, humming something under her breath. She didn't look surprised to see him. She simply moved over, making room on the small wooden bench beside her, as though she had been expecting him to come back all along. "Show me what you found," he said quietly. "All of it. Before we continue, if you're the kind of person who loves piecing together a mystery before it's fully revealed, drop a comment letting us know what you think really happened. We read every single one, and we'd love to know where your mind is going with this." Grief has a strange way of making people either cling to routine or run from it entirely. Alexander had spent 8 years clinging. After Naomi's question lodged itself somewhere he couldn't ignore, he found himself returning to the cemetery more often than usual, not out of habit this time, but because some part of him needed to see her again. Not the grave, her. Naomi wasn't afraid of him, and that alone unsettled him more than any threat ever could. She spoke to him the way she spoke to anyone, without flattery, without fear, without the careful distance most people kept around him. She offered him tea from a small thermos she kept in her gardening shed. She showed him which flowers lasted longest in the cold, which ones needed shade, which ones, she said, just needed someone patient enough to care for them properly. He started noticing things about his own life he hadn't paid attention to in years. The way silence didn't feel as heavy when someone sat beside him in it. The way a conversation about soil and roots could somehow feel like it was really about something else entirely, about rebuilding something that had been neglected for too long. Their conversations rarely touched on his past directly. She didn't push. She let him arrive at things in his own time, the way she let seeds take their own time to grow. Late one evening, sitting on an overturned crate near the tool shed while the sky turned a soft orange, he told her, for the first time out loud, about the woman he had lost and the child that was lost with her. Naomi didn't offer sympathy the way most people did. She simply asked, "Do you know for certain what happened to her? Or do you just know what you were told?" The question sat between them like a held breath. He realized, sitting there, that he had never once asked himself that. He had accepted the story the way a man accepts a diagnosis he doesn't have the strength to question. Slowly, without either of them naming it, something began growing between him and Naomi. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It was quiet, the way real trust usually is, built through shared tea, shared silence, and the strange comfort of someone who saw him without flinching. For a man who had spent years believing peace wasn't meant for people like him, It felt almost unfamiliar. Almost like relearning how to breathe. There were mornings when he would arrive before his usual visiting hour, not because the calendar told him to, but because he wanted to catch the early light the way Naomi always described it, soft and forgiving, the kind of light that made even a cemetery look like somewhere worth living near. She taught him the names of flowers he had walked past for years without ever really seeing, pointing out which ones needed constant attention and which ones, if left alone long enough, found a way to thrive on their own. He found himself talking more than he had in years, not about business, not about the empire he had built out of necessity and grief, but about small things. A song his mother used to hum. A recipe he hadn't eaten since he was a teenager. The particular sound rain made against the tin roof of the house he grew up in, long before any of this life had found him. Naomi listened the way she tended her garden, patiently, without rushing him toward conclusions he wasn't ready to reach. She never asked him to explain the parts of his life that clearly still weighed on him. She simply made space for the parts he was willing to share, and trusted that the rest would come when it needed to. One afternoon, as they replanted a row of flowers near the section she oversaw most closely, he asked her why she cared so much about graves that weren't her own family's, tended by hands that had no obligation to any of the people buried beneath them. Because somebody has to, she said simply. Grief doesn't stop needing tending just because the people are already gone. He thought about that sentence for days afterward. Somewhere in the quiet repetition of tea, soil, and conversation, he began to understand that the version of himself he'd buried alongside that grave 8 years ago might not be as gone as he'd assumed. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday, the kind of day nobody expects to remember for the rest of their life. Naomi had spent the morning cross-referencing burial records against the cemetery's original ledger, a task she'd taken on quietly, without telling Alexander how far she'd already gone. She wanted to be certain before she said anything else that might upset him again. What she found confirmed her worst suspicion. The burial permit wasn't just filed early by a clerical accident. It had been signed off by a funeral director who, according to public records, had left the country entirely 6 months before that date. There was no possible way he could have authorized anything from a different continent. Someone had forged the paperwork. Someone with enough influence to make a false burial look completely official, convincing enough that no one, not even a grieving man with resources and connections, had ever thought to question it. When Naomi brought this to Alexander, laying both certificates and the forged permit across the small table in the cemetery office, he went silent for a long time. Then he said the only thing that made sense to him in that moment. Someone wanted me to believe she was dead, not an accident, not a tragedy. A decision made by someone else that had shaped the entire second half of his life without his knowledge or consent. For 8 years, he had mourned a story instead of a fact. The weight of that realization didn't hit him like anger. It hit him like grief arriving all over again, except this time it came with a question mark instead of a period at the end of it. Naomi watched him carefully, the way she'd watch a plant that had been in the dark too long finally facing sunlight for the first time, unsure if it would recover or wilt entirely. "We need to find out who did this," she said. "And why?" He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something other than sorrow in his expression. She saw the beginning of resolve. That night, Alexander did something he hadn't done in years. He called together the handful of men still loyal to him from the earliest days of his old life, men who had known him before the grief hardened into legend. He didn't ask them to intimidate anyone or dig up dangerous information through fear. He simply asked them, quietly, to help him understand what had really happened 8 years ago, treating it less like an investigation and more like an apology owed to himself. Naomi, for her part, went back to the cemetery's archive room with new determination. She began cross-referencing every name connected to the case, every signature on every document, comparing handwriting samples against other records from the same funeral home during that period. It was slow, meticulous work, the kind most people wouldn't have the patience for. But patience was the one thing Naomi had never lacked. She found small inconsistencies everywhere once she started looking properly. A supply order for a coffin that didn't match standard funeral home procurement records. A payment made in cash, unusual for an institution that documented every transaction on paper. A witness statement from a neighbor who claimed to have seen the fire begin, dated 2 days after the fire had supposedly already occurred. Each new detail didn't answer anything on its own, but together, they painted the outline of something far larger than either of them had originally imagined. A story that had been constructed carefully, deliberately, by someone with resources and motivations that reached far beyond a single grieving family. What followed wasn't the kind of investigation Alexander was used to running. There were no threats, no intimidation, no shortcuts through fear. Naomi insisted on doing this the way she approached everything else in her life, patiently, carefully, and honestly. They started with the hospital that had supposedly treated the woman before her reported death. The records department told them the relevant files had been lost in a system transfer years earlier, an explanation that felt too convenient to be true. When Alexander reached out to former associates who might have known something, most of them refused to answer his calls at all, which told him more than any conversation could have. A retired police officer who had originally signed off on the case agreed to meet them, reluctantly, at a quiet diner outside the city. He looked older than his years, tired in the specific way people get when they've been carrying something heavy for a long time without permission to put it down. "I don't remember much," he said at first. But when Naomi gently placed the forged documents in front of him, something in his posture changed. "There were people," he finally admitted, "more powerful than either of you probably realize who wanted her gone. Not dead. Gone. There's a difference, and back then, that difference was the only thing that let me sleep at night." He wouldn't say who those people were. He said some names were dangerous even decades later. But he confirmed what Naomi had already suspected. The woman hadn't died in that fire. Somebody had orchestrated her disappearance and made it look permanent enough that no one, including the man who loved her most, would ever come looking. They left the diner with more questions than answers, but with one undeniable truth now confirmed. She was alive when the world was told she wasn't. That night, walking Naomi back toward her small apartment near the cemetery gates, Alexander stopped and turned to her. "Whatever we find next," he said, "I need you there when we find it." She didn't answer with words either. She simply nodded, the way people do when a decision has already been made somewhere deeper than conversation. Neither of them yet understood how close they were to an answer that would change both of their lives, not just his. Over the following weeks, they followed every lead the retired officer had reluctantly given them. A former nurse who once worked at the hospital nearest the reported fire agreed to speak with them, on the condition that her name never be mentioned publicly. She remembered a woman brought in briefly for observation around the same time, a woman who matched the description Alexander gave almost exactly, though the hospital's official records claimed no such patient had ever been admitted that week. Naomi began mapping out a timeline on a large sheet of paper pinned to the wall of the cemetery office, connecting dates, names, and locations with pieces of string, the way she imagined a detective might, though she'd never actually done anything like this before in her life. Alexander watched her build that timeline with a strange mixture of guilt and gratitude, aware that this woman, who had no real obligation to any of this, was working harder to uncover the truth of his past than he had allowed himself to in nearly a decade. Patterns started to emerge. Every person who had any real knowledge of what happened had either been paid to stay silent, quietly relocated to another city, or simply frightened into forgetting details they clearly still remembered. Someone had spent significant resources making sure this particular truth stayed buried far longer than 8 years. The question was no longer just what had happened. It was who had been powerful enough and motivated enough to keep it hidden for this long. The cemetery board finally approved the restoration request Naomi had filed weeks earlier, citing structural concerns about a grave that had been slowly sinking into the earth, faster than natural settling should allow. On the morning the coffin was scheduled to be lifted, Alexander stood at the edge of the plot, hands in his coat pockets, watching workers carefully remove the soil that had covered this lie for 8 years. Naomi stood beside him, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched, though neither of them acknowledged it. When the lid of the coffin finally opened, there was no body inside. Instead, there were dried flowers, a small pair of baby shoes that had never been worn, a faded photograph, and a sealed envelope with handwriting Alexander recognized instantly. His hands shook as he opened the letter. Naomi didn't ask if he wanted privacy. She simply stayed close, the way she had every difficult moment before this one. The letter explained everything. She had discovered, in the final months of her pregnancy, that dangerous people intended to use their unborn child as leverage against Alexander. A threat serious enough that staying would have put both of their lives in permanent danger. To protect the child, and to protect him from the impossible choice he would have made to save them both, she chose to disappear completely. She allowed the world, even the man she loved most, to believe she and their child had died in that fire. She wrote that it wasn't because she'd stopped loving him. It was because she loved him enough to let him grieve a tragedy instead of living with the terror of an ongoing threat he couldn't control. Inside the envelope was a second photograph. A young girl, maybe 6 years old, standing in a garden, wearing small gardening gloves far too big for her hands. On the back, in careful handwriting, in both English and Korean, were the words, "If destiny is kind, one day you'll meet her." Alexander looked up at Naomi, and understanding passed between them before either of them said a single word. She wasn't his biological daughter. She had grown up believing her connection to that grave was simply professional curiosity, until this moment revealed it was something far deeper. The woman he had loved, in the years she spent in hiding, had found and raised an orphan child, a promise she made to give someone else the safety she couldn't guarantee for her own. After she passed away from illness years later, quietly, far from the life she once knew, Naomi had inherited both her gardening tools and an unspoken duty to return one day and care for the place that held her memory, never knowing the grieving man tending the same grave was the love she'd sacrificed everything to protect. Naomi wasn't connected to Alexander by blood. She was connected to him by a promise kept across an ocean and a decade. Standing at the edge of that open grave, Alexander finally understood the shape of the last 8 years of his life. Every visit, every apology whispered to a headstone that held no body, every ounce of guilt he'd carried for a death that never actually happened. All of it had been real to him because he had never been given the chance to know otherwise. The woman he loved hadn't left him behind out of a lack of love. She had disappeared to give both of them a future that danger would have made impossible. He read the letter twice more that day, memorizing the careful handwriting he hadn't seen in nearly a decade, searching for anything that might explain where she had gone afterward, or how she had spent the years she'd been given. The letter offered only pieces. She had lived quietly, she wrote, in a place far from the life she once knew, choosing safety over comfort, and eventually choosing to care for a child who needed a home more than she needed answers about her own past. Naomi read the letter herself later that evening, sitting alone in the small cemetery office long after Alexander had gone. She recognized fragments of stories her grandmother used to tell her as a child, softened details that had always felt slightly incomplete, the way adults sometimes simplify painful truths for young ears. Pieces of her own history, she realized, had been quietly rewritten to protect her from a past too dangerous to fully explain. For the first time, the strange, unexplainable pull she had always felt toward that section of the cemetery finally made sense. It wasn't coincidence. It wasn't simply professional dedication to her work. It had been memory, buried just as deeply as the truth she and Alexander had spent months digging up together. If this revelation surprised you as much as it surprised them, let us know in the comments. And if you love stories where every small clue eventually matters, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. The weeks following the discovery were quiet in a way neither of them expected grief and relief to feel simultaneously. Alexander began the long, difficult process of stepping away from the life he had built out of loss rather than purpose. He didn't do it all at once, and he didn't pretend it was simple. Dismantling something built over decades takes time, patience, and a willingness to face people who don't want change to happen. But piece by piece, he redirected the resources he once used for power into something the woman he loved would have been proud of: scholarships for children who needed a chance they wouldn't otherwise get, support for orphans who had nowhere else to turn, community programs in neighborhoods his old life had once treated as expendable. Naomi stayed at the cemetery, not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she finally understood why she'd been drawn there in the first place. The section of graves she used to tend out of simple professional care now held a different kind of meaning. Every flower she planted there wasn't just decoration. It was a continuation of a promise that had outlived the woman who made it. The empty grave itself was transformed, no longer a marker of death, but a small memorial garden, open to anyone who wanted a quiet place to sit with their own grief, or their own hope. People began visiting not to mourn, but to remember that some stories don't end the way we expect them to. One evening, as the sun lowered behind the hillside, Alexander walked over to where Naomi was kneeling beside a new row of flowers. He placed a small bundle of fresh blooms down, not on the grave this time, but beside her. Neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. In the months that followed, Alexander made a habit of visiting the cemetery for reasons that had nothing to do with grief. Sometimes he came simply to help Naomi carry supplies from her small truck to the garden shed. Sometimes he came because she had mentioned, almost in passing, that a particular flower bed needed extra hands before the weather turned colder. Slowly, the cemetery stopped being a place he associated only with loss, and became somewhere he associated with the quiet, steady rhythm of building something new. Naomi, too, found herself changing in ways she hadn't expected. The restlessness she had carried since her grandmother's passing, the sense of searching for a place that felt entirely her own, began to settle. She understood now that she hadn't traveled across the world by random chance. She had been carrying a promise she didn't know the shape of, and had finally, without realizing it, delivered it exactly where it needed to go. Word of the discovery never spread publicly. Alexander made sure of that, not out of shame, but out of respect for the woman who had risked everything to protect people she loved. Some truths, he'd come to understand, weren't meant for headlines. They were meant to be honored quietly, the way Naomi honored every grave she tended, without needing an audience to make the care meaningful. There's something we don't talk about enough when it comes to grief, and this story makes it impossible to ignore. Sometimes the heaviest thing we carry isn't the loss itself, but the silence surrounding it. The unanswered questions we're too afraid to ask because we assume the answer will hurt more than the not knowing. Alexander spent 8 years grieving a version of events he never once questioned, not because he lacked the resources to investigate, but because grief convinced him that questioning it would be a betrayal of the memory itself. It took someone completely outside of his world, someone with no stake in his power or his past, to ask the one question strong enough to crack that silence open. Sometimes healing doesn't come from the people closest to us. Sometimes it comes from a stranger brave enough to ask what everyone else was too afraid to say out loud. And Naomi's story reminds us of something else entirely, that the promises we inherit, whether from a grandmother's gentle warning or a stranger's final wish, can shape our lives in ways we don't fully understand until the pieces finally come together. We'd love to know what you took away from this story. If you discovered you had spent years mourning something that wasn't actually true, would you want to know, no matter how painful the answer might be? Or would some part of you rather keep the version of peace you'd already made peace with? Was the sacrifice she made an act of love? Or was it a mistake that caused more pain than it prevented? Do you believe the truth always finds its way to the surface eventually, no matter how carefully it's buried? Let us know in the comments below. We read every single one, and these conversations are honestly our favorite part of telling stories like this. Think for a moment about the people in your own life you may have stopped questioning simply because the pain of not knowing felt safer than the risk of finding out. Think about the small rituals we build around our grief, the anniversaries, the visits, the quiet apologies whispered to people who are no longer there to hear them, and ask yourself honestly whether those rituals are helping you heal, or simply helping you avoid a conversation you're afraid to have with yourself. Alexander's story shows us that guilt, left unquestioned for long enough, can convince us that punishment is the same thing as love. He believed that visiting that grave every month was an act of devotion, when in reality, it had quietly become a cage he built with his own hands. It took someone entirely outside of his world to show him the difference. And Naomi's story reminds us that the smallest inherited habits, a phrase from a grandmother, a love of tending forgotten places, a simple refusal to let anything be discarded without care, can end up mattering more than we ever imagined while we're living them. She didn't set out to uncover a decade-old secret. She simply refused to accept a story that didn't add up, the same way her grandmother taught her never to accept a wilting plant without first checking its roots. Maybe that's the real lesson buried underneath everything else in this story. The roots always tell the truth, even when the surface has been carefully arranged to hide it. If this story touched you, subscribe for more emotional, cinematic stories filled with mystery, unexpected turns, and the kind of quiet moments that stay with you long after the video ends. Because sometimes the deepest secrets aren't hidden in the shadows at all. They're hidden in the places we walk past every single day.